All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for all making it out for the first session. Well done. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. There will be interpretation in English and French available on the headphones that should be next to you. The session will be web streamed and recorded for your information. So the theme of the session is social media and electoral campaigns. We'll be looking back on the EU elections, and we'll be talking about the lessons learned and the opportunities in the future. The session will run as follows. I will first allow each of our esteemed panelists to make their pitch. I'll give them 5 minutes each to do so. And then afterwards, I will allow a little time for each of them to react, and perhaps if any of them have any reactions to each other's pitches or any questions themselves. And then after that, I will open up questions to the audience. So, allow me to introduce Thibaut, I just asked him for the pronunciation, Le Sénécal, head of the web communication unit in the European Parliament, who will be talking about This Time I'm Voting and the European Parliament's ground game. Anna Maria Jotczak-Segesten, whose many titles I can't list here, but she is a senior lecturer in European Studies in Lund University, among many other things, and will be discussing a study that she's been carrying out on the elections on Twitter. We also have Sean Evans, who is the Politics and Government Outreach Manager for Facebook in London. And he'll be talking about big picture insights into the European election campaigns. And we also have Stephen Turner, who's head of public policy, government and philanthropy for Twitter in Brussels, who will share some stats from the EU elections and talk about measures in integrity and transparency. So I will open by inviting Thibaut to make the first presentation.
So, at 51%, that's European elections in 2019. At the end of the movie, that's the beginning of the next, but it was, or it is, the highest turnout for the last 20 years. So it brings to a major constatation is that those European elections became normal elections. There was always around the European election something like people are not interested, they don't want to go, it's boring and everything, with a low turnout, or lower turnout to demonstrate that. Now we consider that those elections are just classical elections. People are motivated, they go and run, so for us it's a major achievement that they are just, next election will be exactly the same. It's a key moment of the political life in the EU. Flash forward 2 years earlier, when we started to work on the strategy, we had a plan, but actually we had a strategy for the elections. We started to work on it in 2017. Our basis was the Eurobarometer of 2014. And we started to look at some elements that we thought were important for the incoming elections. And we started to look at who and why didn't vote in 2014. Who were the people who didn't go to the vote in 2014? And among all those people, we decided to focus on the people who didn't go to vote for technical reasons. Not because they hated politics, not because they decided that voting was something they will never do again in their life, but just because it was raining this day, or they forgot they had elections, or they were not super motivated. And among those people, we also, and that was the first time that the institution took this decision, it was decided to target the pro-EU people. So basically, our target groups were people who didn't go to vote for technical reasons, but were pro-EU. And why is that? Because we had the conviction in DGCOM that there was a kind of silent, vast group of people who were keen to EU, who were pro-EU, who like the European Union, but never expressed themselves. They don't go, they don't march in the streets because most of them consider it's part of their life. I mean, they've known Erasmus for all their life. They love paying in euro. They are very happy to be able to travel here and there and to benefit from the EU. And we had this perception coming from social monitoring for years, comments on our various platforms, but also a kind of professional inch about it. And that was one of the major strategical aspects. It was to target basically those pro-EU people who didn't go to vote. There were the youth, the students, and the opinion leaders. And then we had 4 pillars for this election campaign. So the air game is about informing everybody. We are first and for all of public service, so everyone should know that elections were coming, where they could vote, why those elections were important. So we established an air game. The most innovative aspect of the campaign for the parliament was the ground game. And ground game is about convincing some. Convincing who? The youth, the students, and the opinion leaders. And to support those 2 pillars, we had media. It's not my field, but I can say that the press officers in all the member states did an amazing job pushing the air game and the ground game to the media. I don't have all the figures, but I remember that in December 2018, we had the media coverage, the equivalent media coverage of May 2014. So 6 months ahead of the elections, we had the same media coverage everywhere as the months of the elections 5 years earlier, and it only increased. And social media. Social media is more my field, so we were extremely invested supporting the air game and the ground game on all our platforms with paid promotion, with a lot of activations that we could discuss. Turnout, when we look at the result, 40 points more for the under 25 years old, or youth target and students targets, and plus 12 points for the 25-39 years old. We noticed all these figures are coming from the Eurobarometer that was published in October this year. You can find it on the website, of course. We found out that voters had a higher level of political education than in 2014, which means we understand that they knew more about those elections. And our opinion leaders, which is a very difficult target, even their vote increased significantly too. And there was also those 135 million views for what we call the hero movie. It's the movie with the babies. I hope you all have seen it. I will not watch it again. Election are over. But this was quite an achievement for us. It was interesting in terms of digital strategy because we published this video only in 2 places, on YouTube and on Facebook only. But the media took it, of course, and the audiences took it and came and watched it. And what is interesting is that it was a bit of change in our strategy because it's a long movie. It's around 3 minutes. We had the TV version of 30 seconds, I think. But anyway, what I wanted to underline is that we managed to drive 135 million views to the hero movie of the campaign. And we were quite happy with that because it was a bit aside the strategy we usually have on social media. But have the people seen our campaign? Well, according to the Eurobarometers, 44% of Europeans recall having seen EP campaign. 44% of a recall rate is quite high in the communication sector. And 27% of the Europeans recalls having seen the hero movie. So beyond the 135 million views, people saw it on TV, maybe people watch it together, we don't know, but they remember this movie. And there's a good reason why, because it was a very emotional movie. It was a campaign that was also a bit on the emotional side, especially for the baby movie, but also on some aspect of the campaign, which was a bit new for an institution. Not new in our communication, because on social media for the last 10 years, we always try to play between emotions and rationality to bring some tonality on our platforms and some emotions, but we really pushed all the buttons in this campaign. In total, we had 97 target groups. Why 97? Because you take 3 main target groups in all the 28 member states, and in some member states, one of the target groups was not pro-EU. It happens. For example, I don't know, students in some countries, they are not really pro-EU. So we took the next one. We took the next target group, for example, retired people that were pro-EU and who didn't go to vote to the previous election. So in total, we had 97 target groups, and in 70 of them, the turnout increased. So to me, I'm not an expert in Eurobarometers and figures, but that's 72% of our target groups who voted more than in 2014. And in 18 member states, 50% of our target groups voted more than the national average. So not only they went and vote, but they voted more. And even in the 9 member states where the turnout was either stable or decreasing, those target groups voted more than the average in their member states. So we believe it worked. We believe it had an impact. It was not the only impact. As you know, the European elections in 2019, there was a lot of political context, Brexit, Trump, and others. And my final slide is about what we are also very proud of. It's a ground game. So the ground game was all about asking people that we don't know to go into the streets and to tell other people to go and vote. That's what we wanted. And we had 330,000 pledged to vote. That means this amount of people who just clicked on the This Time I'm Voting website and said, I pledge to vote. I'll do that. And almost 300,000 of them became supporters. Supporters, they were in touch with us. We were writing to them, we were offering them to spread our messages, and so on. And they were writing to us too. And we had 25,000 volunteers. 25,000 volunteers in Europe, it's, let's say, 800 volunteers in each member state, on average. That's 800 people who helped us physically to do things for the election, to spread the word. That's almost 9% of the total of supporters, which is a double ratio of a usual political campaign according to the benchmark we have, which means that usually you have 3 to 4% of your supporters who agree to volunteer. And those volunteers, they were handled by the information offices of the European Parliament in all member states. They were invited to meetings, to trainings, to events, and they were helping our colleague in the information offices to spread the word on the elections. And a lot of them did things we did not expect. That was the beauty of this campaign. It's a campaign that at some point we kind of lost control, which was part in the plan, never written anywhere, but we kind of lost control about what people were doing and saying about the elections, but it was all in the line of this time I'm voting. This time we need to go and vote, and it was just amazing. So I will leave you with those figures because I think they are nice figures, and I don't know who's next.
Thank you very much, Thibault. So next, I will from Facebook to do his pitch.
Is this working? All right. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being here so early. I see you're all well caffeinated already this morning.
Perhaps press the other one.
Is that not work? There we go. Is that better?
For the camera.
Oh, for the camera. No, I'd rather them look at you than me, so let's be honest. So I'm Sean Evans, and I'm based in London. I'm American, but I'm based in London, and I lead our politics and government outreach team for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa for Facebook. And that's the team that works with those in the government and political space on understanding what Facebook is and how it works. And one of the areas that, of course, I'm sure all of you care about, much like we do, is election security and elections integrity. And so what we're here to talk about today, of course, is what did we expect from the EU election? And that's a pretty loaded question. That's a big question. It's a big election. In fact, it's a lot of different elections. And so I'm looking at the macro here. So let's take a step back to 2016, if you can all remember how long ago that was. It seems like ages. And what we were concerned with in the US election in 2016 was very different than the threats that we face today. We were looking and prepared for terrorist-related content on the platform. What we weren't prepared for was the weaponization of information and data, false news, misinformation, disinformation, coordinated inauthentic behavior, etc. So we were caught a little flat-footed on that. And I think what I want to make sure that we're talking about from my side today is recognizing what the problem was and the threats that we were looking at when it came to this election. And that can be viewed in a lot of different ways, but we look at it in 5 different buckets and problems, and then I'll get into what we've done and what we did around the European election. So basically, the concept of elections integrity and election security, the 5 areas that we look at are disrupting bad actors. That's the first one. If you can't stop the bad actors and the patterns that they follow, then all the other things that we're doing, the products that we put out on the platform, essentially would fall on deaf ears because we're not able to protect the security of the election. So disrupting bad actors is the first thing that we were thinking about. The second is, how do we crack down on fake accounts? I think you would all agree that it's pretty important when you're seeing information on the platform, it comes from real accounts. The third was, how do we limit the spread of false news? How do we reduce false news on the platform? And that's a combination of taking it down or changing it, kicking it down in the news feed. The fourth is being much more focused on transparency, on pages, on advertisements, and I know that's a conversation I'm sure we'll get into later. But that's a commitment that we wanted to make. When you're looking at information on the platform, especially people that are spending money on Facebook to influence the outcome of an election or certainly debate around issues, we think it's important that you have information about the pages that are spending that money. So that's something that we made tremendous strides in. And then the fifth is promoting civic engagement. And that's something that is the cornerstone of what this team has done, and I know what Twitter and other social media platforms really care about, is exactly what Thibaut was just saying. How do you get people engaged and active? How do you hit people where they are, which is on these devices all the time? The last election, you probably couldn't walk down the street without, running into people not on their phones, and now you can't walk down the street without running into people on their phones. And so I think what we're trying to do is always think ahead and try to engage individuals where they're at. So let's kick ahead to the European election and the specific steps that we took to address these issues in advance of that election. For starters, on disrupting bad actors and reducing the spread of false news and fake accounts, there's a few different ways that we've looked for this problem. I think you would all understand that we can't just adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to that. We can't just wipe our hands and say we launched a product, we're good, we're done. That's not how this works. There's consistent and also persistent threats and challenges from different places around the world, whether it's domestic or foreign, depending on the country. They're trying to engage in behavior that's going to disrupt an election. And so what we had to do was kind of shut the door on that. We've invested heavily, and we're continuing to invest heavily in technology and people. Technology, what we're looking at there in particular is AI that detects the patterns of bad actors that they follow, and how do we shut those down so they're not even allowed to join the conversation that we all want to have around the election. Our AI is blocking 1 million fake accounts per day now, or more. That's fairly significant. That's a lot more than what we were prepared for a couple of years ago. AI is blocking 1 million fake accounts per day. In addition to that, our investment in people, because if we only did technology, then we wouldn't have enough manual review of things when people like yourselves, an informed community, are flagging content to us. So we have to make sure we're staffing up on that side as well. We have now over 35,000 people that are focused on security and content review. So we thought that was a pretty good counterbalance to the technology as it was moving forward. Of course, that's not a perfect solution. We have to make sure that we're looking at and balancing this delicate line between free expression on the platform and also security. So we can't just adopt a blanket approach. And that's why one of the next things that we focused on was around advertising transparency. So if you look at Facebook now versus, and especially in advance of the European elections versus 2 years ago, one of the things that you'll notice is that we have pages transparency. You can see on any page basic information about that page, when they were created, where the admins are located, country level. Has the page changed its language? Have they changed their name? And the rationale behind that is because bad actors follow patterns. If I were creating 25,000 fake pages in a basement somewhere, number one, Facebook's AI system should be able to detect that and shut me out. But if I made it, then the level of transparency is critical, because you as informed citizens would be able to look at my page when I'm talking about a particular issue and say, well, this is interesting. This page has been around for a year and they've changed language 12 times following elections around the globe. That's pretty suspicious. Let's report that. So our commitment to transparency on the pages level is promoting more security and information in the community. And then that leads us to the advertising transparency as well. And that's very relevant to this conversation. So for the European elections in particular, we had one of the first times that we had rolled out outside of the US, an advertising library. You can go right now, if any of you, show of hands, has looked into the Facebook advertising library. Facebook employees don't count. Okay, that's good. That's not enough. So maybe after this conversation, more of you can check it out. But basically, we wanted to create a high bar, a high threshold. If you're trying to spend money to engage in conversation or influence the outcome of an election. European election is multiple independent elections for one big cause. And so for that, that presents numerous challenges in itself. But we were able to create this relatively high bar where if you're trying to run political ads, whether you're a political entity or an average individual or whatever it is, and a business, whatever, you have to go through a multi-step authorizations process. You then have to check a box, opting in, saying that you are going to be running these political ads. You have to have a disclaimer that's approved saying who the ad is paid for by. And then all those ads that you run get into a fully searchable for 7 years library with base level demographic information about the ads. That's relevant to this election in particular because of the breadth of the European elections. So now that ad library has been expanded, it's global. You can search by country what ads are active or inactive, and that will exist for 7 years. So when we look at the next European election, we'll be able to look back on ads that ran for this European election. And that is, I think, a good comparison of the conversation that's taking place. Switching to the last bucket of things, if you will, is focused on civic engagement. And that's something, again, that we take seriously. Election security and integrity is a critical component. We have to get that right. We have to be able to make strides in that area. But civic engagement in particular is something that I was very proud of with this election. We launched products, as we have in other elections in the past, to encourage people to vote. We encourage people to register to vote in countries where that's appropriate. Those are, of course, in partnership with different electoral bodies around the globe. You don't register to vote on Facebook. We have a product that engages you, so you can go and engage with a electoral commission site and register to vote there. Over the world, we've had millions of people register to vote through the Facebook tools and products. So that's something we're very proud of. Secondary to that are partnerships around both election security and civic engagement. The events that we were able to work on here with individuals like yourselves, organizations, and bodies like the one Thibaut works with, there are opportunities for Facebook as a company, but then also Facebook as a technology to play an important role in engaging people in conversation. And a lot of that is providing the platform to do so. And so for us, being able to partner with organizations like the European Youth Forum, for instance, to allow first-time voters in a European election to have their voices heard using the Facebook and Instagram platforms and ask questions to candidates on the go, not being in a room where they might not ever get access to, or stand in a queue or hear a speech. They're able to live their lives, do their work, and be able to engage on a mobile phone through Facebook or Instagram, asking questions to candidates for the first time, and also getting responses. That's pretty powerful stuff. That didn't exist a few years ago, right? This is still relatively new in the grand scheme of it. So being able to work with organizations like that is so important for us to be able to provide that platform and some of those resources. So I think with that, I know we've got, I'm sure, moving to other bits here, but the last thing that I do want to say is that for the European election in particular, the commitment that we made around security was paramount, and that was our first priority. The second was on partnerships and how we can work around civic engagement, and then the third was very much focused on education of our tools and products, which we continue even post-election. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Stephen?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. It's my first time at EuropeCon. I was unable to make other years, so I'm really happy to be able to be here to talk about the EU elections. My presentation will I won't try to touch on Sean's toes too much, but we'll cover a number of the similar aspects of how we've tried to bring in more election integrity aspects to the process, but also some of the more fun numbers and that correlate a little bit to how Thibaut presented on the success of the European Parliament, and just showing what kind of activity was taking place and what the conversation was around the elections, both from citizens, from journalists, from civil society, and from political parties from across Europe. So Twitter's goal for these elections was really to further our commitments around what we see as the healthy public conversation and election integrity across the EU. And really what we focused on is looking at citizens from the empowerment, the engagement, and the education side, prioritizing online safety, and as well as election integrity, and then looking at the bigger chunk, which we see as more of building resilience in the long term, transparency, and research aspects. So starting just on the citizen side, working with a number of our partners across the board, obviously the European Parliament being one of the biggest, but also the European Broadcasting Union and a number of other civil society groups. We identified different ways to leverage Twitter to support civic participation and democratic discourse. One of these examples is all of the democratic debates were broadcast live on Twitter through the European Parliament account. The Eurovision presidential debate, for example, had over 2.5 million views during the period, which went up to over 20 million views. And that was broadcast straight from the Parliament account, which is a huge increase when we look back to 2014 and how some of these technologies were used. So just looking at the collaboration and coming together of different sectors, but also different partners to really engage, putting our message out there, but also making it easier for citizens to engage and access some of this information. We also helped amplify campaigns that encouraged voter participation, such as This Time I'm Voting, and launched special emojis in all EU languages so that we could also encourage local and as well as regional discussions around such topics as climate change, and obviously Brexit was one of the big hot topics around this election. Just in terms of key figures, we saw 2.1 million tweets posted just during the election weekend following the EU election hashtag. This is a 273% increase in tweet volume overall around EU election hashtags compared to 2014. This really relates to some of the figures that Thibaut had mentioned, which is that we see the online discussion, the online discourse relating to the offline participation and how you can kind of correlate some of those discussions going forward. The other aspect we see is over 6.2 million views, tweets focused on some of those key hot topics for this election. Obviously, climate change and Brexit, but also very localized and regional discussions on how the impact of the EU, positive and negative, but also critical. So it's always good to see how those healthier conversations are taking place in a positive environment. The long-term goal, obviously, is to empower the users and creating greater awareness and resilience to some of the issues, disinformation or potential threats on the platform. And really what we've seen as building out some of the greater media and digital literacy skills will continue to be a huge aspect of how we as a society push back and prepare ourselves with more mentally resilient techniques to address different types of concerns and understand better what kind of information that we are receiving. We worked closely with UNESCO and a number of other organizations, but particularly with UNESCO recently, and published a booklet on teaching and learning with Twitter. So this is a best practice educator's guide for educators of all kinds, both in the classroom, outside the classroom, and it highlights how to use Twitter in an educational sense, but also highlights the UNESCO media best practices as well. I think the one significant thing we saw this year was that we had the first EU Media Literacy Week, and this was a great opportunity to highlight some of the local initiatives that we've seen spring up across Europe. We did a tea and tweet time with elderly citizens in the UK, which was trying to get them to use Twitter in a better way. As you can imagine, it turned into just an IT help desk situation. But this is a great way when you start to engage with individuals who vote en masse in the highest numbers, but also lack some of or aren't as familiar with some of the tools that we are more native to sometimes when we speak of my young age now. But I think that was a cool initiative that we saw. We did a number of different member states, but it was one of the interesting ones where we saw a lot of different feedback in learning and understanding the different information that's shared and how people use the platform overall. In terms of how we start to prioritize online safety, we had teams in place, obviously cross-functional teams to address potential threats. We have these teams in place on a day-to-day basis because we see these threats constantly emerging. Obviously, there's a heightened a heightened awareness around elections. So this is something that we're looking across the globe, because discussions around elections or potential threats could happen anywhere. For the user side, we did introduce a number of new tools, particularly around reporting fake accounts, improving the way candidates and parties could report exposure to personal information or hacked materials potentially, and introducing tools for citizens to report misleading election information. So if someone's misrepresented what time or date or location a poll or election station would take place, this information could be reported to us as well. And this really helps to support some of the work that the Parliament's doing in getting people out and getting that information out, so that they aren't being misled to go somewhere else, and kind of undermines the whole process. And just in terms of overall our approach to abusive behavior and content on the platform, we've started to manage our own and leverage our own technology to be more proactive in detecting and taking this down. So we are currently flagging for internal review 50% of abusive content. This is compared to 20% last year. So we're continuously reiterating on our processes to better understand and better detect some of the harmful content we see on the platform. And finally, just a few words on transparency. I think the big issue and the newest launch that we had over the past year was the disclosure of data sets around potentially state-backed information operations. These are what we've identified on the platform and have attributed to malicious state actors. This really is to empower academics and researchers to provide more insight and context around where we see some of the threats, and to give citizens and users much more of an understanding of how these threats emerge and how they are actually taking place on the platform. Some are very complicated and very intuitive, but others are pretty lazy. So you can kind of see, depends on which country is using it. But this is something that we've continuously tried to keep a drumbeat on. Every couple of months, we've been able to at least launch some of these data sets. It is nearly 1 year on. It's the largest of its kind in the industry. We have millions of tweets and over a terabyte. This is my millions of tweets, the terabyte of content and media. I recommend you do check it out if you are interested in this area. It is quite a comprehensive space, and it does show you that these threats come from everywhere, even from within the EU. So this is something that we want to continuously be able to provide information in a public way that is accessible. The other aspect is we're moving into a more public discussion around how our policies work. Last year, we launched a public consultation on how dehumanization should be handled on Twitter. Should it be focused on, all men are pigs, or should there something be a little bit more contextual? And I think this is where we've started to crowdsource more feedback and more input from across the globe to get more insights into how cultural and national understandings of some of these really pertinent issues that impact all of us start to work. And I think the next one will come out in the coming weeks. Will focus on malicious or synthetic media, or what people call deep fakes. And this again is a very sensitive topic, and we're looking for as much input as you can. So if there are folks in the room who are interested, please do provide your feedback. I will make a small note on the political ads, as there might be people might be aware of a certain announcement that we had this week. So last week, our CEO announced that Twitter has made the decision to stop all political advertising on the platform. This is a global policy and will come into effect in the next week or two. So next week we'll have the policy, and then the following week we should be enforcing it. I will give you the quote of Jack, as I don't remember all his tweets all the time. To quote, "A political message earns reach when people decide to follow an account or retweet. Paying for reach removes that decision, forcing highly optimized and targeted political messages on people. We believe this decision should not be compromised by money. This isn't about free expression. This is about paying for reach. And paying to increase the reach of political speech has significant ramifications that today's democratic infrastructure may not be prepared to handle." I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, we don't have the policy finalized, so I can give you hypotheticals. But just wanted to get that out there, as I know there might be some discussion on this. Thank you so much.
We love hypotheticals. Okay, and finally, Anna Maria.
Everyone, I'm the academic in the room to live up to our reputation. I'm gonna do that with the help of some slides, so that will be also very boring. But I hope that you will understand why you didn't choose to be in that profession. What I want to do is to talk very briefly about an analysis that I am in the process of conducting about the coverage of the European elections on Twitter. And again, this is data that has not been obtained with the help of Twitter. It's data that I independently collected. And the question that I'm trying to answer is an academic question, as again, up to my reputation, is not to describe just the amount and patterns of engagement, but to try to address the potential for Twitter to become a true transnational arena of pan-European discussions, because that's the interesting aspect about the European elections, I think, at least from my end. It's the fact that it provides the opportunity for Europeans to discuss the same issues at the same time and send representatives to the same important institution. So because there are no borders in the internet world, the transnational aspects could be empowered through conversation on social media, and that was the motivation for me to look at this data, which of course you can interpret in various ways. But for now, this is going to be the focus of my talk. I don't know how much you can see on this slide. This is the number of tweets that I collected, the frequency of the tweets. I'm sure that I missed some of them, as this is, again, a collection done using the streaming API of the Twitter platform. As you see here, I present you data based on about 3.3 million tweets that cover a pretty large period from end of February to the 1st of June. And I'm just going to give you just some ideas first about the patterns of engagement that we observed. Most users retweeted rather than created their own content. This is also something very, very typical. Most people express themselves about politics not through creating their own messages, but by spreading further messages that were created by others. And I think this is quite an important proportion, 3 out of 4. Right. Also, over half of the users participated in these conversations only once. They either created their own message or retweeted someone else's message only once, over this very extended period of time. So even though the numbers look quite great, like a lot of people engaged with this conversation on this theme, the actual amount of users is not really that high. And in terms of how we try to make sense of this, how we try to organize and index the Twitter data, half of the tweets contained hashtags, but not more than half. Again, perhaps you'd expect more tweets to be indexed in that way. They haven't. So we collected data using both hashtags and keywords in order to expand the scope of our research. So most mentioned accounts, most mentioned meaning those that had over 10,000 tweets and retweets. I leave you a moment to think. I wish I had a Slido so we can guess who would be the #1 most mentioned account. Well, I will not keep the suspense too much because the president will cut my time. But hi, who's surprised in the room? Please, show of hands. No, Nigel Farage was by far the most mentioned account, and most, again, including retweets. And then second most mentioned, unsurprisingly, Brexit Party. Third account, it's a code name. Does anybody know what it is? If there's any Catalans in the room, they would know, because it's the account of Carles de Puigdemont. Please excuse my absolute criminal pronunciation, but you know who I'm talking about. Is the Catalan independentist leader that has been also prone to a lot of political scandals and later trials. And then very good news, I guess, from Thibault, because the fourth most mentioned account is the European Parliament English version. Again, I skipped some of these accounts that are all in English because, again, I'm interested in these transnational aspects, and I'm looking at what other non-English language or not English focused accounts are there. And then at number 12, you see the account of a Spanish party called Vox, which is also more of a right-wing party. Again, we can discuss more about that. I'm not going to focus on this aspect in my presentation, but we can do it in the Q&A. At number 14, a very famous activists. I think no, I don't need to say too much. Greta Thunberg, my co-national, is also one of the trending accounts. And at number 16, the first German account, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which is also a right-wing focused agenda party. Most frequently used languages, again, trying to dig into how the conversation was structured. You would not be surprised that about half of the tweets were made in English, and then at a very large distance, second, 16% were in German, and 12% were in Spanish. And then the other countries come at increasingly smaller, obviously, amounts. But as you would expect, English dominates the Twitter sphere because, again, English is the lingua franca of a lot of these conversations. And then again, trying to capture this idea of transnationality, I isolated language clusters and then did some very basic content analysis. I will not show you too much information, but I tried to isolate the conversation in order to identify whether the topics that were discussed in national clusters would be more or less similar across the languages that I charted, and whether the English language cluster was this type of unifying transnational arena. So that's basically what I'm looking for. As you see here, topics are quite different, and the actors mentioned are also quite national. Again, we can think about the European elections as 28 simultaneous national elections because that's the way they're organized. So it's not surprising. At the same time, I'm slightly surprised that there is no more overlap in terms of the topics. So in Germany, you have German parties, and you have a particular topic that is internet privacy, the Article 13. Again, I'm not going to go too much into details discussing the content. We can take it up in the Q&A. In Spain, we have mention of another country, which is Germany, which is a little bit of a transnational reference there, but also news, Última Hora, and España Viva, which is the hashtag of Vox, which is, again, a presence of the right-wing message. In France, we have mentions, of course, of a national politician who is very visible, Macron and his two parties, Renaissance, now I forgot exactly what's the other names, please don't quote me, French people in the room. But then we have the protest movement, Gilets jaunes, and then mentions of Europe. And again, I eliminated from this list all the Europe re-election hashtags, which I already collected for, so they're very obvious going to be part of the data set. And then just to show you the most frequently used hashtag in English, because my hope was that in the English arena, I will see a lot of more transnational topics emerging, but I think my diagnosis is no. The English language cluster was a British topic, where Brexit, Stop Brexit, Labour, a lot of British politicians whose names I'm not going to bring up, but they were also in my top reference, People's Vote, Remain, which are keywords for the different movements within Britain regarding the position of the UK in the EU. And then a couple of transnational, of course, this time I'm voting again, many points confirming Thibaut's presentation that independently confirm your numbers. Future of Europe is one of the debates. Again, Stephen talked about before that it was live streamed on Twitter, and that maybe also generated some more coverage. And interestingly enough, European election results. So Twitter, as always, is a place for getting latest information. So the European election results was a trending hashtag because everybody was following what was going on nationally as they were coming in. So that basically sent it up. So the main takeaways are as follows. Language clusters reveal national topics with very few truly trans-European or pan-European discussion topics at the level of most frequently used models. And again, I did also some supervised topic models that I'm not going to present today, but that certifies the hashtag frequency analysis. English language was not a pan-European arena, but dominated by UK politics primarily. despite my expectations for the opposite. However, there were some transnational topics lower in the top most frequently mentioned, like climate change, again, as Stephen mentioned, but also feminism and internet privacy. So these would be something that united the European public at this level. An interesting question, which again I think we can pick up if you are interested in discussing this further, whether Brexit is a national or a European topic, is obviously treated as a national topic within the UK public arena, but other mentions of Brexit also occurred in other language clusters, and you can also see that Brexit had an impact in the national on the national agenda of other political parties. So you can argue maybe against me saying that maybe Brexit that dominated the UK cluster is a European topic. At the same time, the presence of very numerous and very specific actors, political actors and campaign actors from the UK made me code this as a national rather than European, but we can discuss this. There was also hashtag wars, which again I don't present because it's too much information to visually crowd you with, but there were hashtags that were against each other, support AfD or fight AfD. Never CDU or forever CDU, and this in Germany and in very many other countries. Love refugees, hate refugees, and so on. So those hashtag wars. And one thing that I omitted to put in writing, but I will mention, is that the Spitzenkandidaten, they did not make an appearance as far as I could see, except for the Future of Europe discussion as a trending hashtag. Then accounts or any kind of mentions or any kind of reference to either the persons or the topic of these special candidates was just not visible in my data set. And I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
So we've all gone over time. So what I will do for an initial reaction, surprise them or anything that they thought was interesting or anything that offended them in each other's presentations. And then shortly after, I'll open it to the floor. So if there's any initial.
Am I doing this right now? Yeah. Okay, good. Just making sure. I think the takeaway for me is, number one, the consistency with which social media platforms, obviously I'm approaching it from a Facebook perspective, but hearing Stephen echo a lot of the same concerns and a lot of the same tactics to try to combat elections integrity and security to make it a safer place, I think is a good thing. And our companies and other ones in the space, we communicate well, especially around things like coordinated and authentic behavior. I think that is critical. We have to do our jobs well in that regard. I think what else is interesting is how, instead of the focus being on just social and digital, how, as Thibaut was mentioning, and the data backed it up, how people are using social media platforms as a vector to put out a good ground game and to engage people on the ground and get people talking about issues. And I think seeing data around that is important, and seeing actions and results is even more important. And so for me, it's ultimately a positive thing.
I have a question actually for Thibaut, because again, I'm curious about this transnational planning. Like, how did you approach the This Time I'm Voting campaign to cover all the national context, or was there some form of rooting in some national aspects, or was it just left to the volunteers to kind of adapt that on their own?
What I like in one of your conclusions is this idea of language clusters that reveal national topics. That's the reason why we communicate on social media in 24 languages. We are in 24 languages on Twitter. All the information offices are on Facebook and Instagram in their languages, and centrally we work in English. For This Time I'm Voting, it was totally, it was centralized and decentralized. The website was in 24 languages. This Time I'm Voting was translated in 24 languages. Actually, we didn't plan to have it as an hashtag. That's an interesting story for later, maybe. But it was always connected to the information offices in the member states. So we were communicating to all supporters in their languages that they could choose. At the moment they decided to become volunteers, then they were immediately invited to the closest information office so that they could see in their national context what they could do to support the campaign, what was the most relevant for them. And all this information was exchanged with us so that we could produce adequate material in 1 to 24 languages and also try to react to that. Another way we were taking into account the national perspective is in targeting. It's been for 3 or 4 years now that we only run targeted paid campaign. So we had our target groups. For each target groups, we knew in member states if they were more on Twitter, if they were more on Facebook, on Instagram, or on Snapchat. And then we will always adequately run our campaigns with A/B testing and all. So the idea that it was not a centrally conceived campaign, one size fits all. It was constantly adjusted based on the data. And also on the exchanges we had with the supporters and the volunteers when they were telling us we need to be trained. For example, we had these digital volunteers, they asked us, we need to be trained on Canva because we think it's a bit complicated. So we set up a private Facebook groups, private Facebook Live, and we trained them to the tools that were needed to expand the campaign. And that was not a need we foresaw 2 years ago. It was about, okay, they need that, so we can provide. It was the same in the applause, in the sense that some of them came and said, oh, we'd like to be trained in public speaking. Okay, no problem, we can organize that, we can help you. That was part of the exchange, the idea that we were delivering the tools they will need to spread the message.
Thank you. Thibaut, I had a question. You mentioned the strategy in your approach, and it was, air and ground. What about the sea? What is the gaps? What do you see going forward? Like, what is that extra little bit? And Anna Maria, I think the question on #wars is very interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do you did you see any attempts to remove decisive conversations and try to have like mutual hashtags, like, oh, let's find an in between, and then if not, like, what's that gap that we have to fill, either on the service working together or more of a societal approach?
Well, when it comes to hashtag, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, we tend to think they're a bit overrated because people put hashtag everywhere and too many hashtags in their tweets. And we believe it doesn't help, especially since your platforms have integrated full search. So if you type elections, you will find anything about the election without hashtag or not. We believe the hashtags are, from a practitioner point of view, it's when you have a conversation that is taking place now. So if you're watching a sport event, if you're watching Top Chef or whatever, people will click on the hashtag because they want to be part of a conversation that is happening now, and they want to see the best jokes or the best comments. In the context of the elections, we didn't want to impose an hashtag, and we had an official one, which was the EU elections 2019, which was more like a kind of branding exercise to make sure that, yes, we are talking about the election here. And we wanted this time imvoting.eu to be an URL because we wanted to recruit supporters. And if we would have used the hashtag, they would have joined a lot of interesting conversations, but they would not have clicked on the link to go to the website where we're wanting them to pledge to vote. So sometimes you need to have some tactical choices. But we were totally okay when we saw that people decided to use this time I'm voting as an hashtag. So of course we jumped on this. And I think that the lessons to learn of that is that you don't always decide the way people want to handle your communication. If they've decided that this time I'm voting was the EU election hashtag, so let it be, just like embrace it. So we started to combine, we started not to multiply. And then we saw that, yes, this time I'm voting was systematically almost in English and in the language of the tweet. So in France, you almost always had, this time I'm voting, cette fois je vote, hashtag, in the same tweet. Fine for me. They are not trying to create, I think, a timeline of conversation at the time. They were just trying to brand themselves and to demonstrate they were part of something bigger than them. That's my perception. So the hashtag was, again, used in another way, not as an ironic comment, not as a live conversation happening all the time, but more as a kind of badge of honor to say, I'm taking part into this conversation, into this campaign, because it's important.
And I'll just quickly jump on this just to say that this was one of the reasons why this time I'm voting was such a trending hashtag. And it was, for me, a sign of this pan-European conversation, the fact that people in different languages felt the need to nevertheless join the conversation or attach themselves symbolically, indexing themselves to this time I'm voting. So it's, again, for me, it's a sign of European public sphere rather than isolated language. This one being more the exception from the rest of the picture that I painted. In terms of hashtags, I actually think hashtag wars are something positive. I think it's part and parcel of the game of politics when you have people acting for or against different ideologies, and as long as they're transparent and as long as the content of the message is legitimate, I think it's actually quite interesting to see the families, the clusters of ideologies that are at play, and who's allied with whom, and probably future steps in my analysis would be to see which accounts use these hashtags, and can we identify some strategy behind it, or is it really grassroots, which I suspect there is a lot of grassroots activity. And that is the beauty of Twitter, and this is the reason why Twitter is probably the most studied social media platform, the fact that it's very alive with all sorts of discussions that are very impromptu. You don't plan it, it just happens. You react to something that has been said, news that are being communicated by journalists and so on, and citizens really can make quite an impact. I didn't show you, but the most active top 10 most active accounts were all citizen accounts. There was one bot account, but out of top 10, 9 were actual citizen accounts, not institutions, not media, not journalists, not NGOs, citizens. Very active, so activists, ideologically motivated citizens, but nevertheless private individuals that were very active in tweeting and retweeting. So I think it's clearly a space where the citizens, apropos civic engagement, I think this is where we see it. It's really powerful and it's really obvious. Sometimes maybe for the wrong reasons, if you're having ideology tainted. So to say, why should the AfD or Vox be the most trending? Because their voters were very mobilized. Also the voters for the Catalan independentists, the voters for the Scottish National Party were also very mobilized, and they were very visible. So I think the hashtag wars are just a way to mobilize more civic engagement, and I think it's actually, I'm looking forward to looking into them even more.
Thank you all. And now I think it's about time to open questions to the floor, of which I can, oh, wow, okay. So, in the interests of efficiency, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to take questions in clusters. And if I feel that somebody might be indulging themselves a little bit too much, I have a yellow card. And that says that I hope you finish in the next couple of sentences. Okay, so.
Hello, my name is Bianca Bäumler. Among other things, I am organizing for International IDEA and DevCo a conference on AI. So my question is, what are you and your colleagues working on in terms of AI? The one thing that I picked up that you mentioned in Facebook is the identification of fake accounts. So are there other fields in which you are using AI? So mainly, actually for anyone, if you're working on it.
Thank you. My name is Mikko Salo. I'm representing an independent fact-checking organization that is mostly engaged nowadays with internet literacy. And thanks, a very, very timely and very good debate, and very happy to see also Facebook here. Just to put a little bit the discussions in the framework, we were all very worried last year, for example, here on the disinformation sides and all that type of things. But the key issues that we kind of touch, but not to the extent that we are still talking about the fundamental advertisement companies, business models, and all that, and how to live with that one in the times when this is used for malicious things. I think the Europe kind of survived it, perhaps with a better narrative that we all kind of tried to contribute. But my question would be especially on this ad policies and advertisement things, because I think that was just a mere start, what was taking. Twitter is doing things a little bit more proactive. Facebook just went under real pressure. Your ad library basically was a kind of a copy, your internal copy of a Who Tracks Me, that would have been an independent scrutiny of the ad library. So what are you going to do it? Because I think in order to really build trust in the internet, you have to have a third party actors like researchers to get the access and to scrutinize the thing. And for that, I really thank Anna. I mean, actually, a very interesting presentation, and even if it's built on the independent data, so because that's what we need to build trust. So, what would be the next steps, and especially on these critical ad library things on privacy and micro targeting that can be used very, very maliciously. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Honey Cohen. I'm from BirdLife Europe. My question is for Mr. Evans, and it's twofold. So first of all, I was wondering about the decision to block pan-European organizations and their European campaign content. I realize that this can be inspired by how things work in the US, but it's very different in Europe. As a pan-European organization, we like to reach out to all 28 member states. Secondly, I'm wondering about the decision to make environmental information, why to class it as political. It's science-based, it's factual. Why can't environmental organizations say, if you care about the environment, go vote, whilst that is still big? Thank you.
Reverse. Deal with them. Yeah. First, thank you for the questions. I saw a lot of hands, and so we'll be able to hopefully address more of the questions after the fact. And so touching on yours first, and thank you. I think I want to address the environmental bit, just going in reverse order here. For starters, the way that we identify political ads is not to point fingers and say you're a political organization. That's not the purpose. The way we define political ads are those that are either electoral in nature, saying vote for me or go vote. Now, one thing to note that I didn't mention is that if you're saying the opposite of that, don't vote, that's voter suppression. We remove that entirely. You can't have that sort of advertisement. But back to environment. Us identifying political ads as either electoral, we think is of course appropriate. Now, the other thing is, what do we do about issue-based ads? Or organizations that are trying to encourage people to vote or to support a particular candidate or a party. We think taking a kind of wider net approach there is an appropriate step. If you're trying to run an advertisement to, basically the thematic here is, if you're spending money to try to influence the public debate or discourse around an election, not just a particular candidate, not just a particular party, but around the election as a whole, we think it's appropriate to go through the process. It's not necessarily a terribly complicated or difficult process, and we're not going to stop somebody from engaging on the platform, but by going through the process to have your ads included in the library, if they're part of that similar conversation, whether you're an environmental organization or an activist individual or a small business talking about business and the economy in the elections context, we think it's appropriate to have visibility into that. And so it's not trying to say you're political, you're not, and it's same with different organizations and pan-European orgs, and we'll get to that in a second. It's not trying to place a label on anyone. It's more the conversation that's taking place. If you're spending money to try to influence public discourse and debate on Facebook, we think it's appropriate to have a disclaimer saying who's paying for the ad. And especially in the example that you gave, when you say go vote, that's relevant. It's relevant in an electoral context. Now, what we did allow for, if you thought that you ran ads that were placed in the library inappropriately, you have the ability to appeal that decision, and more than half of those that were appealed were reversed. And so that's something, we have flexibility. It's not just a hard line. To answer the first question on blocking pan-European ads, it wasn't a decision, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. The European election is not one big election, it's 28 individual elections. So we have to look at electoral law. This is one of those areas where there's not a lot of consistency, and we really have to approach this in that way. Now, what we did allow for, you can still run ads in different countries, but you have to have an authorized representative from your page in that country that's going to be running ads in that country. So effectively what we weren't doing, we weren't blocking the organization, we were blocking the ability for one organization, whether they were political or not, to run ads across border without an authorized individual in each country. Does that make sense? I know it's supremely complicated, but understanding the thought process behind this, we have to approach it around electoral law. And Anna Maria mentioned this earlier. It is 28 individual elections with all their own individual electoral law, and so we think it's appropriate for people to have to follow those laws in lieu of something multinational. It was not an easy decision, of course, and I'm happy to talk about that further. Also, if you're ever interested in the tough decisions and debates that we have like around this internally, we have transparency around that as well. We have a Hard Questions blog internally on our newsroom. I'm not sure how many of you read our newsroom regularly, but it's probably worth checking out. And we have these debates around different issues like this one play out, and we publish those. Oh, there's loads of other questions, sorry.
I might direct the question on transparency first to Anna Maria. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that first.
Yeah, I wanted to support the question and the idea that we need more transparency. I think Facebook has done a great job at first creating the syntax. I think it's great that it exists, but I think it's also a place to take it further. I think input that you receive from the civil society and from academics like myself, I think only will help to make that product better. And I think the suggestions that were made in the room, I support them as well, in the sense that we need even more searchability and more information to be able to really make that database usable for the purposes that you guys created. So I only wanted to say that I agree. I also wanted to comment briefly on this AI question. I think all the platforms obviously have to deal with AI because of the volume of information that is being produced. You cannot possibly manage that at a human level, right? At the level of academia, there's also several projects that are almost reverse engineering some of the AI that is generated by the platforms in order to see what is happening, because these algorithms are obviously not public. So there are several people at work trying to see how the algorithm works, and generally speaking for across platforms. And also there are several projects that try to identify so to say, fake news or material that is artificially generated as it is being created, without looking at the content, but looking at the actual metadata, so the properties of that particular image, video, or text. So there's ways you can detect that. And I personally am involved in several projects at different languages and different sections, but I think there's a lot going on in that capturing or being engaged in a kind of cat-mouse game with those who create these deep fakes and try to propagate disinformation. So I think there, again, the platforms and researchers are working towards the same goal, but maybe with different tools or strategies. Thank you.
And maybe just to add on the AI side, I think to Anna Maria's point, it's really that balance with transparency and understanding how the services work. Because I think when we talk about AI, it's very broad. It could encompass anything from traditional AI sources to content moderation to how you view and interact with certain types of content. On Twitter, you have approximately 1 billion tweets a day. The scale, obviously, and how you start to manage that becomes a way where resources and individuals behind this scene will have to have tools at their disposal. One of the ways we started to do that, and in the idea that we want to build healthy conversations, but we also want to remove a lot of that burden that has historically been on users to report, block, and manage their own ecosystem in a certain way, has been to be more proactive. Obviously, flagging potentially harmful content for review is already one step of using AI in a specific way, but also looking at the algorithm itself. We've had many discussions internally, and some of the progress that you see now is that we have a switch that you can turn on and off the algorithm on the timeline itself, so you can have a free flow, or you could have something that's a little bit more algorithmically matched. So you can include safe search, which removes people that you don't follow from your conversations, or people who've just started a new account. So the potentially harmful areas of the online space, I would say in the offline world, it's that one street you don't go down. How do you remove how do you remove that one street from your day-to-day enjoyment of the platform? So we have put on both sides, so you do have the tools that you can kind of manage that. This is always going to be a progress, and as we see new challenges, how can you better leverage technology, ensuring that you have people managing it, but also having good transparency for the users themselves. So trying to get all of that information out there in a clear way is also one of the big challenges. We redid all of our terms of service and rules this year to put them in tweet form and then give them a much clearer way and remove everything down to I think around 2,000 words in total. So trying to give people clearer ideas of how our rules work. I think this is another aspect of just building that overall resiliency online. The same way you have stop signs in the offline world, people understanding what you can or cannot do is a great tool. And I know this goes beyond AI, but I think it's essential to how we interact and use some of our services. One of the examples we always have is that we started to give notifications for individuals who've for hate speech or hateful conduct on the platform. 65% of those people who've now learned what they can or cannot say do not repeat ever again. We really see like the harmful content on the platform as being 1% of people trying to be malicious or harmful, and the rest there just need to be educated on how to deal and how to interact. There's obviously those heated situations, football matches where two teams are going at it, and you might say something horrible in the heat of the moment, and that's always going to happen. To Anne-Marie's point, it's a live and public conversation on Twitter. You're going to get some live emotional conversations, and not all of those are going to be as healthy as you want them to be. Some of them are going to be a little dirty, but it is allowing that conversation to evolve, and even seeing how people interact and come together in the end is something that we want to ensure as well. And I'm sorry that digressed a little bit from the AI discussion, but
Sticking on the theme of AI, I know I touched on it when talking about the election security bit, and of course that is a very important and very timely thing to think about, but we do a lot more than that as well. And I mean, for instance, we're funding an AI and ethics center in Munich that we just recently announced, so I think that's relevant. And this, obviously AI and that sort of technology is where it's all moving, and so we think having more transparency and certainly ethical conversations around the use of AI is highly appropriate. We want to make sure it's fair and inclusive, so the AI that we work on, we have to make sure that it's right, and we have to make sure that it's scalable and that it works, and we have a lot of internal tools and checks on that. And give you a little insight, some of the internal tools make sure that people have the ability to weigh in if they think there's biases on AI before it happens, before it goes live. And so that is kind of our internal checks. That of course there is no perfect system, but what we've seen between an internal commitment to that and then external partnerships with AI, and obviously there's going to be more in that space, and then on the election security front, where the AI has gotten so good that we're effectively blocking 99.8% of the fake accounts at the point of creation, so before they have the ability to engage in conversation on the platform. I think that's relevant. I don't think I mentioned that stat earlier, but I think it's highly relevant for this conversation.
Yeah, not on artificial intelligence, I'm afraid, but I wanted to go back on what you said, Sean, about the transparency rules. And you know that we disagree a bit about that, because I think that's important to realize for practitioners what it meant for us. Thanks to you and your team, we survived. But it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare because suddenly we had to find one authorized officer in each 28 member states with a mean of payment to be able to run political ads, or ads that were considered as political because it was topical on issues when we considered they were not political, but that's another debate. And I think we are all for transparency and integrity and preserving the election process. That's extremely important to us. But I think that there was a timing issue. The implementation of the ads, of the new rules, came quite late. For us, it was just before we were launching the movie. And the second thing, where we needed to have a pan-European campaign everywhere, full power in every member state, because part of the trick was to gather as many views as possible in the very beginning. And it was almost impossible to do, but we managed. And the second thing, it's also there's a bit of, and I'm trying to find a word, a bit of naivety, eagerness, naivety, you say in English? Naivete, from the perspective on Facebook. Because in all those instances, on all these debates, we always talk about the public pan-European sphere. That's something I've been in the job for 15 years. For 15 years, it's always, if there's a public European sphere where people talk in all languages about common issues. The answer is that there is no such a thing, but there are attempts to that. Attempts by what we do, by what was the ground game was, by the fact that people are using, like you said, international hashtag with their own hashtag to just show, okay, it's part of a larger debate. but I'm just bringing my stone. And there are a lot of pan-European actors that want to foster this debate. Of course, the institution, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, we want to address the European citizen at their globality, taking into account their differences. And of course, we need to run pan-European campaigns. And you know that the institution were not very happy with that. You have the NGO. Some NGOs have a European agenda, and I think it's great because it's also a way to bring the causes from north to south and east and west. But you also have the political parties, the European political parties. They are extremely important actors because they are the ones that try to break this national cluster. They try to show that they have common views from different countries and that they will sit together. And I think in the democracy, it's super important. They will never have the resources. I don't work for them, but I know them a bit because they turn to us. And they will never have the resources to have 28 accredited officers with everything. It doesn't work like that because there are an extra layer in the political process. And there are a very important extra layer for the European election. So I think it will improve. I think it's an important way. But let's face it, it was an obstacle in the final run of the campaign. And that was perceived as such by a lot of practitioners and by a lot of people in the field.
I'm sorry, guys. I hate to cut off an interesting conversation in the middle of it, but I also think that the audience should also continue to take it. So I'm going to take a few more questions. I'll start with the gentleman far down the back there.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all for your input so far. My name is David, and I had a question for both Sean and Stephen concerning electoral ads. Because I know your companies recently took really different turns. Facebook, you know, or at least according to what the media says, is no longer fact-checking electoral ads. So I'd like you, maybe Sean, to give us your take on this. And then on Stephen's case, it's completely the opposite direction. As you mentioned, you know, your CEO decided to block all electoral ads. And also, I would like to get your perspective on this. And then at the end, if you can, to comment on each other's approaches. You know, and, if Stephen can comment on what he thinks on Facebook's new approach, obviously diplomatically, if possible. And yeah, the same for Sean. Thank you very much.
No. Oh, wait. We're going to
take a couple more. So I'll take this gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, Nicholas Bruno. I'm a digital consultant. I work with Climate Kick, which is the EU's climate innovation agency. We are having on Facebook already issues where a lot of our ads, which are actually, you know, promoting our programs for accelerator and youth involvement on climate programs. It's not political advertising, and these are already being stopped by Facebook. So we're having issues there, and we are also told that climate change will also be on Twitter one of the issues that are not allowed to be advertised. So will that be only for political advertising on Twitter, or will it also be, you know, throughout the year, all the time? Will climate change be an issue? Because from what I understand, you know, most scientists agree that climate change is actually happening, and traditional media is actually already saying that climate change is a fact, right? So it shouldn't be seen as a political issue if it's not, you know, part of a campaign or part of a political process. And my second question is actually, you know, in the fact that Twitter will not be having any political advertising in the future, what do you see as the trends, and how, you know, perhaps will influencers now be, you know, the key to sort of a lot of groups amplifying their voice? What are kind of the trends that you can see? Perhaps Thibaut maybe has some strategies here that he is already thinking of. So it'd be interesting to hear that part of the issue as well.
Thank you. I'll because that's technically 4 questions. I'll stop there for now.
I don't know what are the trends. I hate to do some prediction. I don't read the future. I try to survive the next 6 months. That's quite important. You know, it's always the same. It's radio didn't kill newspaper, TV didn't kill radio, and so on. So when we started social media 10 years ago in 2009, it was all about disintermediation. Let's cut the middleman. Let's cut the media. We never did that. We never stopped talking and working with the media. We just moved on social media because we wanted to reach people where they are in a different way. The ads, are part now of the mix, of communication mix. If you're serious in your job, you need to have paid promotion. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It doesn't matter which platform you're working on, it just doesn't work if you don't have paid promotion. New rules are coming. I don't have the details for Twitter. I'm waiting, like everyone else. I'm waiting to see what it will mean for our business. What we see is that what we wanted to build 10 years ago, and we're still working on it, it's a bond of trust with audiences. The European Parliament, as a communication on social media, is not here to break the news. We're here to comfort the news. We're here to tell you this is what is happening. This is what happened, and we can explain. We want to build a bond of trust with our audiences. And of course, we want our audiences to spread this, because people believe more real people than institutions. They will trust more their peer, they will trust more people they know about news. Our job is just to provide and say you always have a neutral interlocutor that is trying just to tell you what is exactly happening in the best possible ways. So of course, online influencers are important for us because most of them are passionate for some topics. Most of them, when we invite them to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, Brussels, they want to meet MEPs. They want to stream the plenary and the debates because they have their opinion on it. So of course we will do that, but we will never pay for producing content or this kind of things. It's more establishing connection with them. The same with the volunteers and supporters. The idea is that if you're interested in something, tell us and we try to provide. I don't know what will be the trends, but I think more and more this aspect of personal interrelationship in the digital world between people you trust, but that have access to sources that they trust, that they endorse, such as us, will be key. So we will keep working on that. And this time I'm voting is now together.eu. You're all welcome to join. We are in a listening phase. We had a study where 12,000 supporters answer, telling us, this is what we would like to do with you. This is how we would like to work with you. And we are looking at it to draft the next plan.
I want to comment very briefly on this. I think, again, to your point, what are the consequences of banning political ads? I think this is something that's empirically going to be tested, and also depending on the rules that are going to be crafted more specifically. But one clear trend is that exactly what the Jack Dorsey tweet was saying. Organic content, which means content that is generated by citizens or NGOs organically, is going to be the one that you will see in politics or in anything else. So organizations that mobilize their voters strategically will be more visible than organizations that don't have that connection. As you have seen briefly in my data, the organizations that were most able to mobilize their voters were usually fringe parties that do not represent the mainstream, whereas mainstream parties were probably less represented. So this could be a trend, in the sense that the richer parties that could easily get away with advertising would be at a disadvantage, and maybe smaller parties that rely very much on influencer and citizen campaigning would be at an advantage. For example, it's something to expect. But it also depends, as you were saying, what is the political aspect. This is the difficult decision that Twitter has taken upon itself to be the arbiter of what is politics, which I think it's a very difficult task, including such issues that you brought up. But I think, yes, citizen mobilization and citizen participation will be encouraged by the lack of political ads. And in a sense, this may be an interesting democratic experiment. So I'm not sure that we should necessarily be very critical of it in and of itself. So, thank you.
All right, lads. Who's right? Who's wrong?
I can dive in. I think it's important to note that each company is making decisions in the best interest of the company and the users. And I think for us, addressing this issue around fact checking as a whole, in the macro level, we have fact checking partners globally. And those fact checking partners, it's a rigorous process to get into that. We have over 30 across the globe. And you have to be International Fact-Checking Network and Poynter certified to do that. And the goal of that is to reduce the spread of viral misinformation on the platform. So we have a policy, and we have invested a lot to try to get the concept of reducing the spread of misinformation correctly. It's of course not perfect, but between AI, between the investments in people, and then with fact-checking partners in different countries, we think it's appropriately reducing the spread. And there's a lot of academic studies that will back that up in a lot of different places from a lot of different countries. Of course, again, not perfect, but we're getting better at this. When it comes to fact-checking politicians, that is something that we don't feel like it's appropriate for a private company to police political debate. When it comes to fact-checking political debate, what we're not doing is fact-checking for political debate from politicians themselves. What we are doing, however, is providing transparency, as I was talking about earlier. With transparency comes scrutiny. By making a very high bar for politicians to not only show who they are and have a disclaimer saying who is paying for that ad, but also having not only the content of the ad, but also lots of demographic information. And of course, that's looked for that to be improved over the years, but you have the ability now to go into our advertising library and see information around political ads from politicians themselves. We think that's appropriate. It's a high barrier for entry. They have to go through a lot of steps to do that. You can see lots of information, lots of demographic information. You can also, and this goes to an earlier question, it's a relevant subject, we have an API for that for academics and NGOs to review as well. So we have the ability to build additional layers on top of that. What we're not trying to do here is have a private company police political debate or news. We think that is far outside of the scope that's appropriate for us. But by providing an unprecedented level of transparency around these sort of issues, what that enables is watchdog groups, news organizations, journalists, citizens, activists to do their jobs and be able to surface this sort of content and engage in the right level of public debate and scrutiny around these issues.
All right, thank you. Thank you for those questions. David does not get any more questions. No, I think it's extremely important. And as I mentioned before, this is a policy that we're building out, especially from the political ad side. You know, determining what is politics is kind of a good statement. I don't think it changes from what it was previously. I look at the EU elections where you have a number of different countries taking different approaches to electoral process, timing of elections, releasing of candidates. There's no harmonized approach on anything. Some countries have electoral laws on advertising, majority do not. The ones that have recently done it are not quite clear on how those are supposed to look. So I think there is a lot of challenges that currently exist. A lot of it, when it comes back to how our services differ, and I think Sean did a good job of kind of explaining it, but it just highlights the different use cases and how we have been explaining that, you know, people use our services in a different way, and the policies that we make should reflect our values as a company, but also as our users and our citizens use our service in these kind of situations. And I think that's the approach that we've taken. We collaborate when we see state-backed information operations, terrorist content, child sexual exploitation content. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on in tackling these harmful actors online across platforms, industry, and even coalitions with media and other stakeholders in the ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of collaborative work that goes on that comes into the electoral context as well. To give you some granularity on where our thought process is, I think Jack had his thread tirade there on his thoughts, and I think one of the areas that we're clear on is that we want to ensure that get out and vote kind of campaigns are not included in our policy in trying to block those, especially from, you know, the experience with the EU elections, but also other issues that might have a time sensitivity. We're looking like candidates, parties, and upward. So how do we build a policy that's looking at the people that are around the political context? Again, I don't have any further details, but obviously these are things that we're taking into consideration. Issues like climate change, Me Too movement, and a lot of these issues that face us at a global level are going to be pertinent to better finding the right tone. But this will also be a reiterative process where we continue to build on the policy as we see the challenges. And no doubt, when we launch it, we will see a lot of feedback. So we welcome that. Just remember this face when you're doing it. That's all.
One sentence. Because we're both in our companies kind of operating in a space here that a little bit without a net, what we are looking forward to doing, of course, is engaging with individuals like yourselves and the new commission, the new parliament, to work on what the goalposts for this actually look like.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for us. Please give our panelists a round of applause. Thanks to our interpreters, our technicians, and for yourselves for your questions. Have a nice morning.